Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf pei. We are at the Mishnah at the very top of daf pei, and we are in the fifth perek, which has continued this topic of the fourth perek about selling various things. In the fifth perek, we've sort of switched to things that are technically often not attached to the ground, not 100%, but generally. And now we're going to talk about what happens if you purchase the produce that something is going to have. So, for example, we're going to talk about the produce of a dovecote. What's the produce of a dovecote? It's the little birds that get born in that dovecote. And then we're going to talk about a beehive. And what is the produce of a beehive? Well, there are really two different kinds of produce. One is if you want to have your own beehive, so then the produce will be the bees. And if you alternatively, we can talk about the honey. And so we'll be talking about all of that. So let's jump in. Again, top of the daf pei amud aleph with the Mishnah. Halokeach. Let me share my screen, and then we'll really be able to get started. So here we go. 1 second. I thought I had opened the document. Let me just check. I have not, so let me just do that right now, and then I will be able to share my screen. So here we go. Okay, so
David, do you saw this?
I will talk about it afterwards, okay? All right, so here we go. Here's the screen. And again, we're talking about we're at the Mishnah at the top of Daf Pei Amud Aleph, 80a. So the Mishnah is going to address the purchase of produce associated with certain items. So, halokeach peiros shovach mechavero, if you buy the production of a dovecote from your friend, so mafriach brecha rishona, that you're going to end up allowing the first one to fly, the first pair to fly. So what exactly does that mean? So thankfully, Rashbam is going to help us out. So let's take a look at the first two Rashbams. So halokeo perishova, kugon sha'amar lo b'Nisan. So you say to your friend in Nisan, machorli peiros shanazu, sell me the produce of this year from your dovecote. Mashi yaldu, what the birds are going to be. B'chol chodesh, every month. Aval ha'imaos, the mothers, lo kana. You're not going to acquire those mothers. V'derech hayonim la'asos shnei vladot b'chol chodesh. And the doves seem to have about 2 children every month. Zachar u'nekiva, often one male, one female. Chutz mechodesh adar, except for chodesh adar, which is sort of like the end of the winter. She'ein yoldin, they don't have any children that month. V'hanu vlados gam heim l'sof beis chodashim osim vlados. And then the children, about 2 months later, they will have their own children. B'kol chodesh, every month. V'kol shnei vladot kruyim brecha. And every 2 children, that is called a brecha, a pair. And again, those are the pair that will live together and be married to one another. So mafriach lokeach brecha rishona meniach lepeiroach im ha'em. So the first pair, the first children, are kept by the seller in order to stay with the mother. She'otan lo machar, that those are not sold. Shekain derech hamocher peiros shovach, that the custom was that those who sell the produce of a dovecote, la'akev brecha rishona, they would hold on to the first pair of children. Liyot savot leimaot, they, in order to remain as companions to the mothers. Lihit kayem hashovach, in order to facilitate the ongoing nature of the dovecote. Because pen yivarchu ha'imaot, if you took away all of the children, well, then the mothers would feel like there's nothing for them to do, and they would fly away. V'hu shovcho, and that would result in the loss of the shovach, of the dovecote. V'hu shovcho lo machar, and he didn't sell the whole shovach. So as a result, hilkach mistama gam brecha rishona shel shana zu ikev ima shovach. So as a result, the first pair that is born in each year, we're talking about the sale of a dovecote, you're selling the produce, you're selling all the children, but the first set of children, we need them to stay around in order to be companions for the mother. Because that's how we establish and ensure that the dovecote remains. And the Gemara will explain the gam peros harishonim, that even the first pair, dahi brecha rishona shi'er hamocher liyot savot lahach, that even that first pair will also get a first pair in order for them to be able to stick around. Im brecha rishona, pain tivreach, lest they run away. Daha a'ima lo mitztavta, because it's not, she with the mother is not a sufficient companion. And if that first pair will run away, tivrach gam ha'em, the mother will also run away. And so as a result, the dovecote will be lost. And that's what I understand from the Gemara. So that's case number one. If you purchase a dovecote, if the produce of a dovecote, you're going to get you'll be able to get all of the children except for the first pair. Now, if you're wondering, hey, didn't we see at the end of the day yesterday that you can't sell something that doesn't yet exist? Yes. So that's an excellent question. And the way we're going to understand it is, although you can't sell, I can't sell you a pair of birds. I can't sell you a pair of birds that are going to be born, that I don't have the eggs, I don't have anything from them. Mm-hmm. But what I can sell you, and this is, I think, the easiest way to answer this, what I can sell you is about something that exists. I can sell you whatever comes from it. Okay, so although I can't sell you a particular pair, I can sell you the produce, the potential of what comes out from something that exists. It had the thing that I'm selling you has to exist. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two, another possible interpretation, and that's the way the Rambam would take it. Another possible interpretation offered by the Muke Yosef says that actually, if everybody agrees, yes, in general, we can't sell something that's Shelo Bala Olam that hasn't yet come to the world. But if you and I decide that we want to go through with the transaction when the item does exist, then fine. Then we're allowed to do it. We don't have to renegotiate. And so that can be a second way of understanding this Mishnah. But in any event, I prefer the first. I think that it makes a lot of sense. And so we'll stick with that, but it won't really have a ramification for the rest of our learning today. So that's item number one. Item number two in our Mishnah, Peiros Kaveres. If you're selling the produce of the fruit, the resulting production of a beehive. And the Rashbam explains, what do we mean in this case by Peiros Kaveres? So let's take a look at the next Rashbam. It's 1, 2, 3, 8 lines up or so in the narrow lines of the Rashbam. Shel Shana Achat, for 1 year. You're selling it for 1 year. Devorim Hanoldim Min HaKaveres, the bees that get born that year. So what do? Notel Gimel Nechilim. You take 3 swarms. Umisares, and then you cut it off. Now, misares often means to cause to
castration.
Exactly. So we're going to see the Gemara is going to talk about that interpretation and whether that's actually what is meant. But again, we're going to just leave it with cut off. But let's take a look at the Rashbam, who again tells us what the situation is or what often would happen. So noto gimel nechelim, gimel chaburot, hanoldot rishona. The first 3 productions would go with to the buyer. Begimel zmanim, mitet yamim o yud yamim. Basically, every 9 or 10 days, they would have a brood. One after the other. Shekain derech hakaveres betchilas yemot hakayetz, in the beginning of the summer, yotzi min hakaveres nechil shel dvorim, a swarm of bees will come out. Yaldos sheyaldo ha'imaos, all the mothers will have given birth. V'yoshvin al anav ha'ilan, and they will dwell on the branch of the tree that the beehive is on. Umaybe kaver chadash, and they'll bring a new beehive. Umachnisun l'toko, and then they'll go inside it. Became l'sov tet o yud yamim, and so too every 9 or 10 days. The yotze nechil shel dvorim, another brood will come out. Acher, umaybe kaver acheret, and they'll bring another hive. Rekanit, an empty one. Umachnisun l'toko, and then they'll go inside it. V'kein hashlishi, v'korin lo tirtzil, v'yesh she'osin ad zayin v'chet pamim b'malchus Yavan. That in Greece, this would happen 7 or 8 times during the summer. Umalchus zu, but in this area, namely in France, ruban osin gimel pamim. So most of them do it only 3 times. The ashlishi garua, and the third one is the worst one. Mikulan, of all of them. The acharon garua, because the last one is always the worst. Hilkach dai begimel nechilin rishonim shehein chashuvim. So it's sufficient for a seller to just transfer 3, which are the more important ones. So that, which is a sufficiently significant situation. So that's the story. All right.
3 reproductions?
What?
You mean 3 reproductions?
3 reproductions, exactly. Three as defined here, swarms, but the bottom line, 3 sets of reproduction. Exactly.
Now we have an expression, acharon chabibi.
I know that's true. We do. This is a an alternative. So anytime somebody says, "Oh, acharon chaviv," you should say, "Well, sometimes it's acharon garua." Okay, so 100%. This is obviously different. So chalos dvash. What happens if you sell the production of honeycombs? So meniach beis chalos, you need to leave over 2 honeycombs. And Rashbam explains, if we take a look at the 5th of the widest lines towards the end of the line, chalos dvash, hakaveret, from the hive, la'achar she'asta peiros, after it has made its new productions, v'yatsu hanechilim, and the swarms have taken off. Lokan es hadvash, you take the honey. V'hu asli chalos, and these honeycombs are made in combs. The yeshbo yud chalot o esrim, then there'll be 10 or 20. Zebitzad zeh, one next to the other. Mishava v'dvash, me'urav b'yachad, and they're sort of made out of a mixture of wax and honey. And if you are selling the produce of your honeycombs, lo machar as hakaveres, you have not sold the beehive. Rotzehu lahachnisa b'yamos hageshamim, because he wants them to be able to go there in the wintertime. Lehatzniya l'shana haba, in order to be safe for the coming year, to basically, what's the word I'm looking for?
The second, it's available to produce more honey the next year.
Yeah, but the to hibernate, that's the word I was looking for.
Oh.
Those payros, in order to eventually make another set of production. V'hilkach mistama shire beis chalos, and so that's why we can say that presumably the person will hold over 2 of the honeycombs. Lehit parnes behen hadvorim, so that the dvorim can hibernate there. Be a mot hageshamim, in order in the wintertime. So that is the story there. Okay, and zeitim lakots, if you are selling the produce of an olive tree for cutting, meaning you're selling the wood of the olive tree, meniach shtei grofios, you need to leave 2 limbs behind, 2 of the branches behind. Presumably these are the lowest ones, in order for them to be able to have the get the chlorophyll and all the other things that are needed in order for the other branches to regrow. And that is the story with respect to olives. Okay, so olive
You're
trees.
learning Lahit Parnesis hibernate. I would read this Lahit Parnes Ben Advarim Beimot Geshamim as that's where he profits from them. Lahit Parnes means to, right, to have make a living. So he's making a living from the bees that would be in the that would develop during the winter.
It could be. It could be that that's what the interpretation is. That could be. Okay, so yeah, I mean, that very well may be the case. I mean, certainly from the word parnasa, parnas could be that. Yeah, okay. All right, so now the Gemara is going to quote a brisa that conflicts with our Mishnah. So the brisa says, "V'hatanya brecha rishona ushniya." Once again, you need to leave the first two pairs of birds. It's not enough to leave the first pair of birds. So Amarav Kana Lo Kasha Hala Ima. When we say that we need to leave the second pair, that is for the first pair that's being retained. And Hala Ima, and the first pair is for the original mom. So we end up with 3 generations of birds that are retained by the purchaser. So Maishna Ima. So now the Gemara asks the question: what's the difference between the mother, the original bird, the mitztavta abrata v'azuga the deshavkinan la, that is going to stick around based on the fact of the daughter and her mate and the original bird's mate. So we'll call it the husband. So why is that sufficient for her to stick around? So inami, let's say about the daughter as well. Titztavta aima va'azuga deshavkinan la. Let her stick around because her mother is there, and then she'll have a partner and she'll have a husband. And so let her stick around based on those two. So the Gemara answers, Ima abrata mitztavta, brata aima lo mitztavta. No, it's the nature of the world that the children go out on their own. So if the daughter, so if it's your daughter, if it's the bird's daughter, so the bird will stick around for its daughter. But a daughter won't necessarily stick around for its mother because, that again, that's the way of the world. So how do we get this bird to stick around? We have it make sure that it holds on to its first, its first child, first set of children will stay around in the nest. And so the seller gets to retain not only the first set of birds that are born, but the first set to the second, the first set to this first set as well. So as a result, there ends up being 3 generations of birds that the seller gets to retain in his dovecote when he sells the production of the dovecote and not the dovecote itself. Okay, so Peros Kaveres, Notel Gimel Nechilin Umisaris. So you sell the produce of a beehive, you get the 3 swarms, and then misares. So b'mama sarsan, how do you sterilize them? How do you castrate them? So it's certainly not surgery on an individual basis. So Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. So Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, answers that actually we do mean an element of preventing further births, and it's done b'chardal. It's done with mustard. So Amri b'ma'arava mishmei de Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. So in Eretz Yisrael, in the name of Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, it was said that lo chardal masarsan, the mustard doesn't literally sterilize them, elamitok shapian chad, but rather because their mouths become bitter, meaning they have a bitter taste in their mouths. Chosros va'oklos as dushanan. They're going to go and eat their honey. And what's the result of that? So let's take a look. Va'oklos as dovshan. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 lines up in the Rashbam from the bottom of the page. Umitoch saviatan, because they are satisfied and they are full. Betelos Mapiria Barivia. They're not going to have relations and engage in procreation. V'chosros v'osos dvash, and instead they'll go back and they'll make honey in the honeycombs. So that's interpretation number one of why they're having the honey will prevent them from having more children. The Rabbeinu Hananel Perish, Rabbeinu Hananel explained, ochlos dvash, they end up eating the honey, shenikve hachalos, that create space in the honeycombs. The chosros umigdalot b'nikavim, and they go back and they grow in those holes. The Ikalameimar, and there are some who can say, Dilashana haba yoldu, that as a result, there'll be a new brood in the next year. Otan hadvorim v'yu shel mocher. And so now there'll be a new brood in the new year, and the seller will get to keep it because he's only selling the produce of one particular year. Obviously, if he sells the next year's produce, so then that would be what he sells, but he's able to sell it separately. So that's the concept. So
well, what does it mean? They go back in the holes that they made so how does that make them impotent, as it were?
No, well, the point is that it may not make them impotent. It makes them so that they don't go out, and so there is no bees to give. There's no new swarm. Any kind of leaving of the nest is going to wait until the next year, and so that's going to be considered the sellers as opposed to the buyers. That's how I'm understanding it. Not completely clear, but the bottom line is that in the note here it suggests that there won't be any children until the next year because they've created room for themselves to hibernate. And so as a result, they'll effectively go into hibernation because they've eaten the honey, which has created room for themselves in the hive. So they
won't produce. They won't produce more bees.
Correct, because they're hibernating. That is how the Rabbeinu Hananel explains it. I somehow the Rashbam's first explanation feels sort of like a more interesting explanation. But in any event, those are the two explanations that Rashbam quotes.
I don't know. I would think if they're are they in, you begin to extrapolate here, but they're in
correct.
Holes.
Don't extrapolate too much.
If they're lying, if they're in holes, aren't there? Maybe there are more than one bee in the hole. Does each one have his own hole? I mean, I don't know.
It certainly sounds from the way the Rabbeinu Hananel is explaining it as if they each have their own hole. But I can't be certain. But okay, so that's one possible interpretation of Mesares, that it does mean to sterilize, and it means that it's done effectively through their feeding of mustard. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar, no, it does not mean to sterilize. Notel shlosha nechilin b'seirus. Rather, you're supposed to take it b'seirus, and Rashbam explains, Rabbi Yochanan, lo asirus shel zichros. It doesn't mean to castrate. But rather, Myri Kalal, right? That's not what it means at all. Ella, high Sirus Lushan Dilug. The language of Sirus is a Lushan of removal, of alternation. Zuhu. Kamo Kara Sirusin, B'Meseches Megillah Yerushalmis. As in reading alternatively, reading one and then skipping, as it discusses in Meseches Megillah in Yerushalmi. V'Hagi Kamar. And this is what we're trying to say.
Because the word to skipping, is actually sirugin. So I'm wondering if sometimes the samach is like a gimel. There are letters that like a tough and a shin.
100%. 100%. And this is what our Mishnah is saying. Noto gimel nechilim. You're going to take 3 swarms. Al yedei dilug, through skipping. Rishon, Shlishi, V'chamishi. You'll take the first, the third, and the fifth. V'hamocher yutol hashar, and the seller will keep the others. Sheyelish shneihen min hatovim, so that both of them get from the good, umin hakachushim, and from the weak. Shekain derech stam mochre kavaris, and that's the custom of a seller of the produce of a beehive. So, b'masnisa tana, in a brisa it was taught, notel gimel nechilins b'zeh achar zeh. Well, contrary to Rabbi Yochanan, this is essentially a third answer. It was you would take the first three, and mikan ve'elach notel achas umaniach achas. You would take one and leave one. And Rashbam explains. Rashbam actually notes here. Tana v'hagi hilchasa. And this is actually what makes sense as the halacha. De brisa ikar. That this brisa is the core. The gam lashon hamishna de katani umisares kain mashma. That in fact that's what our Mishnah really implies when it says umisares. Shetchila notel gimel nechilim. That first you take the first three broods, ritzufin in a row. Va'akar misares notel echad and halokeach notel echad. That first the seller will take one, and then the buyer will take one. Umeniach echad, and then they'll leave one. L'tzorach hamoker, in order for the seller. Meaning, actually, I think it's zen notel echad halokeach. Nokel echad, omeniach echad l'tzorach hamoker, and then you'd leave one for the seller. So the bottom line is that you'd end up getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. So that would be the way that the Rashbam would understand it. It seems.
How is he learning? Who takes the first three? Notel gimel nechalim.
No,
the buyer.
The buyer definitely gets the first three. Okay, so chalos devash maniach shtei chalos. That if you buy the honeycombs, so you got to leave two behind. Amrav kavana devash b'chaveres eno yotze midei machal la'olam. The honey in the beehive is always considered food. Now, there are two ways to understand this, and we'll see them in Tosfos. Hold on, and Rashbam. Alma kasavar lo by machshava. So we see that there's no thought process that's required to make something to make the honey into a food. So let's understand what Rashbam says with that. Dvash, afilu b'kavarto, even while it is still in its honeycomb, Eino yotze midei machal, it does not leave the category of food. Even though sometimes the bees will sometimes eat their own honey, nonetheless, Eino yotze midei machal, it doesn't leave the category of food, even though it's kind of disgusting to think that you're going to eat something that the bees would be eating. And according to Rashbam, that continues until you make a decision. When you make a decision that the honey that's left in the honeycombs is going to be for the bees, so then it's no longer food. So that's one possible understanding. Inami dafka b'kavarto havi ocha. Or alternatively, what we're saying is that only when it's in the honeycomb is it actually food. Aval imzav mekavarto, if it flows out of the honeycomb, havi mashke, now it becomes a liquid. Because we know that when it comes to the 7 liquids that can cause something to be capable of being a food, of being capable of becoming tameh, a food that grows from the ground, of being capable of becoming tameh, honey is one of those 7 liquids. Honey from bees we're talking about. So mistama, having mashka mistama, it would ordinarily just immediately become a liquid. Ela im kain chishev alav achila, unless you specifically think about it that you want it to remain as a food. Kedetanya behedya rosh brisa the Maseches Taros, as we note in the beginning of Maseches Taros. Okay, so Tosfos has a problem with Rashbam's first explanation, because look into second Tosfos, Dvash b'kavarto eno yotze midei machal olam perish hakuntris ad yikatsuhu l'machal dvorim, until you set it aside for the food of birds. Beferish, with explicitly, but that does not appear to be the case according to the Ri. Because according to the Ri, you don't have any kind of food sheyoil bo shum davar that will change in its category anything ad sheyivsol machilas kelb, until it becomes less than something that is edible for a dog. So the bottom line is that this honeycomb honey will, once it's become food, should never change just based on a person's thought. It needs to actually become disgusting in order to change on the person's thought. So that's the position that Rav Kahana offers. So now we're going to challenge Rav Kahana's position. So they
So he's
challenged it.
talking about a change from Michael for a beaver to Michael for Adam, B'nai Adam, to a Michael for a bee, right?
Correct. That is what the Rashbam says. That Rashbam
That's a
says
Tosfos. Tosfos, it does not change.
Tosa says that even when you think that you want this honey to now no longer be food for a person, but to be food for the bees, that is not a sufficient thought to cause the honey to no longer be food. As a result, the Tosfos presumably would agree with the second interpretation of Rashbam. That actually what we're saying is that the food that the honey is considered food in the beehive, but as soon as it flows out of the beehive, it becomes a liquid.
A liquid. Oh, that was really was my question. I think you answered. I was saying that Tosfos is focusing on the machshava to change it from Michael Adam to Michael B. But he doesn't. But he doesn't say that the case if once it becomes a liquid, it's taken out. Then he would say it's a change, right?
Yes. Then he would say it's a change.
It's a change from Ochel Michael to Mashka.
Exactly. So that would be how Tosfos presumably would, the Re would presumably understand it. And again, Rashbam offers both explanations. And the Gemara easily can be understood in either direction. So let's take a look and see what the question that
one small I would raise is that today I don't know then, but people eat honeycomb. Not only the honey, but eat the honeycomb. So
correct. So there's a logic associated with the second explanation in Rashbam, 100%. So Meisvei. So Dvash b'kaveret eno lo ocha v'lo mashke. 1 second, we have a brisa that contradicts Rav Kahana. So how can Rav Kahana say what he's saying? Because of course Rav Kahana is an Amora. How can he say what he's saying when there's an explicit brisa that contradicts it? So Amar Abaye, lo tzricha el osan shteichos. No, when we say that the honey is not food or a drink, we're talking about the first two honeycombs that the seller holds on to. And so for those two honeycombs, those are going to be food for the bees. And so as a result, there's not a question that those are not food for humans. And so as a result, because there's never a possibility of those being food for humans, or at least no general intention for those to be food for humans. So as a result, that's why the Brisa will say that those are not considered food. But for others, that's what Rav Kahana is talking about. And so they would be food. So that's answer number one. Answer number two, Rava Amar, Rabbi Eliezer, it's Rabbi Eliezer. Now, as we turn to pay him a bet, let's remember back, and the Gemara is going to remind us of what Rabbi Eliezer said. We saw this back on Daf Samach Hey Amabet, and now we're going to remind ourselves of it again. It is a Mishnah from Shvius. It's also in Uktzin. So Kaveris Devorim, if you've got Ditznan, Kaveris Devorim, you've got a beehive. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Harehi Kikarka. It's like land. What does that mean that it's like land? Because you can write a prosbol on it, meaning that if you need to if you want to collect a debt after Shemitah, so you can submit a contract into the court, and the court will enable you to enforce it. And as a result, but the only way you can do that is if the borrower has real property. And so this ownership of a beehive is considered sufficient real property for that purposes. The Einim Mekabel is Tuma B'Mkoma, and it will not be capable of becoming Tameh. So that's consistent again with the Brisa that we just saw that says that it's not food and not drink, because it's not capable of becoming tamei. And if you detach any of the honey from the honeycomb on Shabbos, you're chayav chatas, because it's as if you removed something from the ground. The Chachamim disagree, and they are consistent with Rav Kahana. Ain kosfin ala prosbol. You can't, it's not land, and so you can't write a prosbol. The aina kikarka, so it's not like land. Umakabelas tuma b'makoma, and it is capable of becoming tame. So it is like food, even in its place. And if you take any honey out on Shabbos, you're putter. So again, Rav Kahana is just like the Chachamim. So Amar Rabbi Elazar. Now we remind ourselves, not only did we learn that Mishnah, but we also learned the explanation of Rabbi Eliezer that was taught by Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar, of course, is an Amora, but Rabbi Eliezer is the Tana. My time of the Rabbi Eliezer. What was the reasoning for Rabbi Eliezer? Diksiv v'yitbol osa b'ya'aras hadvash. It says in Shmuel Aleph that Yonatan dipped into a forest of honey, but the problem is that honey doesn't come in forests, meaning obviously there can be a honeycomb in a forest, but the forest is not made up of honey. So what's this connection of a forest to a honey? How can we connect those two? So just as we say with respect to a forest that somebody who takes something from it on Shabbos is chayiv v'chatas for taking something out of the ground, so too when it comes to honey, if you take some on Shabbos, it's as if you took it out of the ground, meaning that the honeycomb is like karka, is like ground, is like earth. Okay, so now meisvei. Well, 1 second. You want to say Rava, again, Rava is the one who answered that it's based on this machlokes that that Rav Kahana and that the explanation between Rav Kahana and the Brisa is based on the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. So let's take a listen, because we have another Brisa. Dvash hazav mekavarto. If you have honey that oozed out of its beehive, Eino lo oka v'lo mashka. It's not food and it's not drink. Now, bishlam ala Abaye nicha. According to Abaye, this still works, because if it's the honey out of the first 2 honeycombs, well, that was never food. And so as a result, it's still set aside for the bees. And so as a result, it's not going to be considered food or drink, and therefore won't be capable of becoming tameh. Elul Rava kasha.
Well, it's
But
not
according to
never. It's
Rava,
not
let me just
food.
finish the question. Elul Rava kasha. But for Rava, this is a big difficulty, because the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is only when the honey is still in the honeycomb that it's considered attached to the ground. But as soon as that honey flows out of the honeycomb, it would seem that Rabbi Eliezer would agree to the Chachamim that it's considered separate from the ground and therefore considered like food. So how do we answer that? So now, if you have a question on the question, I'm happy to take it.
Yeah, it's getting a little confusing here, but we're saying it's according to Abaye, it's not food for people, right?
Correct. It's not food for people because it was set aside as the 2 honeycombs for the seller to retain in order to help propagate the honey and the bees for the next season.
So even if it oozes out on its own,
even if it oozes out, we can explain that because it was not food, because it's already food for the bees, even when it oozes out, it remains food for the bees, and it doesn't automatically become food for humans.
And
without a machshava, without thinking about it. If you were to think about it and say you want it to be food for humans, so then it could be. But the way we're understanding it is it's not food. It's not automatically food for humans now. Whereas, based on the Rava's explanation, where it's based on the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, that machlokas is only in connection with the honey while it's attached. Indeed, the words attached are in the Mishnah, or in that Mishnah, where it says, the Eina Mekabelas Tuma Bimkoma, while it's in the beehive or in the honeycomb. That's when it won't be considered capable of becoming tameh. But as soon as it flows out, then it would be. So now Rav Zvid comes and saves the situation for Rava. So Amar Rav Zvid, Kigon Shazav Al Gabi Klemius. It's because the honey oozed into something that was disgusting. And so because it was not food in the honeycomb, and when it came out, it went onto something disgusting, so it's still not food. So therefore, that's the story. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar Kagon Shazav Al Gabi Kashkashin. No, you don't have to go so far as to say it was disgusting. As long as it never becomes food, that's sufficient. And so if it oozes onto splinters of wood, so then also it's not going to actually have ever been food for humans. And so therefore, that could be the situation of Rava's. That could be the situation discussed in that brisa. So Meisvei. So 1 second, I'll ask you another question on Rava from another brisa. Dvash b'kavarto. That there's a brisa that says that honey in a beehive is not food nor drink. That's fine. But if you think to make it food, mitame tumas ochlin lamashkin, then it becomes capable of becoming tame like food. And lamashkin, if you think about it as drink, mitame tumas mashkin, it becomes thinkable. It can become tame as drink. Meaning that according to this brisa, thinking is sufficient to change the status. But 1 second, according to Rava, the machlokas between Rav Kahana and the brisa is a machlokas of this between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. And according to that machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, your thoughts can't change whether the beehive is considered earth or not. It's land. It's going to stay as land, whatever you think. And therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, your thoughts can't make a difference. So what's the situation that's covered by this brisa according to Rava? So Bishlam Abaye Nicha, according to Abaye, again, it all makes sense because we can say that this is talking about the 2 honeycombs that are set aside for the bees. And so as a result, if in your mind you decide that you're not setting aside for the bees, then it becomes food or it becomes a liquid. And of course, this really goes well. This particular brisa, it goes really well according to the Tosfos / second version of Rashba.
That's Tosfos. I was thinking of Tosfos.
Yeah, exactly. So, but Ela Rava Kasha. But according to Rava, this seems really difficult. How can the honey be changed, have its classification change when it's still considered land? So Amar Lach Rava would say, Taritz Hachi. Answer it this way. Reread the brisa. Basically, we're going to say that the brisa has an error in it, and we're going to say it says the following. So basically, he rereads this. He would have to change effectively the language of the brisa to say that it's not capable of becoming tummy like food, and it's not capable of becoming tummy like a liquid. And so that is how Rava would have to answer that. So clearly, by the way, I mean, it certainly makes more sense to say like Abaye. But in any way, Tanya Kavase de Rav Kahana, and it all, we have a brisa that confirms Rav Kahana's view, Dvash b'kavarto, mitame tumas ochlin, shelo b'machshava, that when it's in the honeycomb, it is like food, even without any thought that's necessary for it. Okay. So now we get to the last case of our Mishnah, and the last case of our Mishnah dealt with the olive wood. So
how is Rava? How can Rava say that this whoever we're dealing with, that the honey when it's in the comb or not? I'm not even sure what it is exactly, but how can he say that it's not metame? Either it is or it isn't. Isn't that a fact? Where don't we say that mashke, like devash, is one of the 7 liquid?
Yes, but the point is that again, remember, Rabbi Eliezer says that when it's in the honeycomb, it's considered like land, and just as the land can't cause something to become capable of becoming tameh, so too the honey is not considered a liquid at that time. It's not considered a food. It's not considered anything. It's considered just like an apple, right? That's attached to a tree, right? The apple, can eventually ooze out apple juice. But the point is that when the apple's attached to the tree, it's not capable of becoming tame because even though it's an apple, and it might be, you could even take a bite out of it while it's attached to the tree, and it certainly seems like food, but we're not treating it as food because it's still attached to the ground. So that's the explanation. Again, that's Rava's explanation. It's a lot simpler to answer it like Abaye did. Okay, but in any event, now we go to the last of the cases in our Mishnah, and the olive trees that we said you can leave behind. You have to leave behind 2 branches so that the tree can regrow. So now we're going to discuss what about other kinds of trees. So first, we're going to deal with trees, generic trees, and then we'll deal with some specifics. So Tan Rabban, halokeach ila mechave rola coats. You purchase a tree in order to get to cut some of it away, meaning namely you're cutting it for wood. Magbia mina karka tefach v'kotzis. You can raise it from the ground 1 tefach, and then you can cut, because as long as you've left a tefach above ground, along with the entire root system, that tree is going to regrow. And so that it makes sense to purchase in that way. However, bisulas hashikma, if it's a virgin sycamore, meaning that it's never been cut back before, this is the first time that you're cutting back the sycamore, well then gimel tfachim. If you want to cut it back, you got to leave at least 3 tfachim above the ground. Sadan hashikma, if this tree was a cut sycamore, so then beis tfachim, 2 is enough. B'kanim ugfanim, when it comes to reeds and vines, mina pakak ulamala, you got to leave it from above the first, knot is how they define it here. But basically, it's where it changes direction. Essentially, is how I understand it. B'dikalim uva arazim, when it comes to a date palm and a cedar, chofer umasharish. In those instances, you can take away the true tree completely. Lefisha ein gizan machlif, because those trunks are not going to regenerate. So as a result, if I sell you the wood of my date palm or my cedar tree, I am really selling you the entire tree, because there's nothing that you can cut back and have me left with something that is going to regrow. So now, ubasulas hashikma gimel tfachim beinan. So question number 1 about this brisa: do we really need 3 tfachim for a sycamore tree that's never been cut back? Uraminhu. Listen to the following Mishnah. This Mishnah is in Shvius Perek Daled Mishnah Hey. Ein kotzitzim basulas hashikma b'shvius, that you're not allowed to cut back a virgin sycamore during Shvius, because then it's like you're working on the land during Shemitah, and you're not allowed to do that. Mimnei shehi avoda, because that's the kind of work that is forbidden during the 7th year. Rabbi Yehuda Omer kedarko aser, it's prohibited to do it in the normal way. Ela magbia yud tvachim mekotzis, but you're allowed to leave 10 tvachim above the ground and cut it back. Ogomim me'im haaretz, or you can cut it at the ground level and cut it back. And the reason is because in these instances, presumably it's going to harm the tree and not help the tree. So what is the implication? Is that cutting it me'im haaretz hu dekashi, when you cut it at the ground level, it's going to be bad for the tree. Ha'idach ma'alila, but if you cut it above the ground, even at 1 or 2 tvachim, it's going to help the tree. So why did you say in the brisa that we began over this discussion with that gimel tvachim is needed, when in fact it seems that even 1 or 2 tvachim will be sufficient to be helpful? So the Gemara answers, Amar Abaye, gimel tvachim ma'alila. No, you have to understand, 3 tvachim, it's definitely helpful for the tree. Mi'im ha'aretz, when it's cut down to the bottom of the ground, vade kashila, then it's definitely not helpful. Mikan ve'elach, however, between these sizes, between 1 and 3, between 0 and 3, lo mikshi kashila v'lav aluye ma'alela, it's not going to necessarily be helpful for it, hard for it, and it's not necessarily going to be helpful for it. So Gabi Shvius, when it comes to Shvius, Avdinan midi devade kashla, you can do something that's definitely harmful. gabi mekach umemkar. But when it comes to a sale and you're holding back for yourself, well, then abdinan mida devade malila. You got to do something that's actually definitely helpful to it. So as a result, that's the explanation why in one case it seems like you have to cut down to 0 to be harmful, and you have to leave 3 in order to be helpful, because we're trying to get to a definite situation. And Rashbam actually uses this to say that cutting back a tree and doing that kind of pruning during the Shvius year is a Isser D'Oraisa. And that the reason that we're going to say that between 0 and 3 is problematic is because we say Suffolk D'Oraisa L'chumra. Okay, so that's the story. Okay, so now b'dekalim of our reason mechofer misharish lefi she'ein gav'an gizan machlif, that you can cut down a palm or cedar completely and even take out the roots because the trunks don't regenerate. 1 second, the erez ein gizo machlif. Are you telling me that a cedar doesn't regenerate? V'hadarish Rabbi Chia bar Lulyani. But 1 second, listen to this teaching of Rabbi Chia bar Lulyani. My dixiv tzadik katamar yifrak erez balvanon yiskeh. That when we say, as we read on a regular basis in Tehillim, Perek, Tzadik Bet, Pasuk Yud Gimel, that a righteous man is going to flourish like a date palm and like a cedar in the Lebanon. He's going to flourish. So why do we say both of these? Why do we reference both the date palm and the cedar? Im nemar tamar lama nemar erez. Why do you say both? Im nemar erez lama nemar tamar. If you say the one, why did you say the other? So ilu nemar erez v'lo nemar tamar. If we only said the cedar and didn't mention the date palm, hayiti omer, I might have thought ma erez ein osa perus. Just as a cedar doesn't have any fruit, namely that there's no production in this world, meaning that maybe there's no reward for the behavior of good mitzvot in this world. They can understand it that way. So avtzadik ein osa perus. So too, a righteous person doesn't have any fruit in this world. L'kach nemar tamar. That's why we needed to reference also the date palm in order to tell us that of course a righteous person produces fruit. V'im nemar tamar. And if we learned only tamar, we're about the fruit. V'lo namar iris, and we didn't say anything about a cedar. Hayiti omar. I might have thought ma tamar ein gizo machlif, that when it comes to a date palm, it does not regenerate when you cut it down. Av tzadik eino gazo machlif. So too, when you cut down a tzadik, it does not going to regenerate. So lekach nemar erez, and therefore we also reference the erez, namely that not only do we have a world, rewards potentially in this world, but we also have the regeneration rewards, namely the rewards in the next world. But what's the bottom line? The point is that here we just said that a cedar will regenerate. So how do we answer it? So ela hakabamayaskinan. Here's what we're talking about. Bishar mini arazim. There are a variety of kinds of erez trees, and we're talking about other kinds of erez trees. Kid Rabba bar Rav Huna, as Rabba bar Rav Huna noted, Dama Rabba bar Rav Huna, Amri Bey Rab, they taught in the yeshiva of Rab, Yud minim arazinhem. There are 10 kinds of arazim. Shenemar, Etain b'midbar erez, shita b'hadas ve'et shemen asim, etc. And so Gemara now tells us each of the kinds of things. So erez arza. Erez is an arza. Shita is turaninsa. Shita is a different kind of tree. Hadas asa. Eitz shemen afarsma. Barosh barasi. Tidhar, Shaga, Visashur, Shurvina. So we've got now 7 different kinds of erez trees. Well, Hani Sheva, Habi, you've just mentioned 7. What are the last 3? So Kiasa Ravdimi Amar Hosiva Alehan Alonim, the Almonim, Almugim. So he added these 3 others, the Alonim, the Almonim, and Almugim. So Alone, Butne. The aloni is a butne tree. Almonim, here it translates as an elm. Almonim, belute. And almonim are oak trees. Almugim are casita. That's some kind of coral tree. So ika da amri, aronim, armonim, almugim. Or we could say aronim is are, is a laurel tree. Armonim is a dulbe, is a chestnut tree. And almugim is a casita, is the coral tree. So we reached the final Mishnah. I'm sorry, the next Mishnah, and the Mishnah will now deal with the sale of trees. And not surprisingly, because we just talked apropos of the conversation that we just had of the 10 different kinds of erez trees. But the bottom line is that certain erez trees do not regenerate, and those erez trees, if you were to sell the wood for them, you'd be entitled to take the buyer would be entitled to take the entire tree, including the root system. But other kinds of erez trees do regenerate, and therefore you would have to leave for them, presumably at least a tefach, based on the generic understanding that, again, trees in the generic sense, you need to leave at least one tefach above the ground. So stay tuned for the discussion of the sale of trees. But again, for that discussion, you'll have to stay tuned for tomorrow's daf.
We just have one quick question earlier.
Hold on just a second. What? Go ahead, Ken. Say again.
There was one question I have, because it passed by me quickly. You, in the discussion of the bees, you mentioned, I think it was Abaye and Rava near the end of that discussion, or one in the middle, that one of them was an Amora and the other was a Tana. They couldn't argue. Which one was which again?
No, so Rav Kahana, who's an Amora, said that honey in a beehive is always considered food. And the problem is we have a brisa that says that honey is neither food nor drink. So Rav Kahana doesn't have the ability to argue with that brisa. So the question is, how do we understand those two statements? How do we make those two statements consistent? And that's what Abaye and Rava were answering.
And Abaye and Rava, they're tonight.
They're Amoraim, absolutely.
They're Moraim.
Yeah, 100%. I was not suggesting anything to the contrary. But the point is Rav Kahana, who's made his statement that honey in a beehive is always considered like food, he can't just argue with the brisa that says that honey is neither food nor a drink. So how do we understand those two statements in a way that makes them consistent with one another?
But he's also an Amora. He's also an Amora, right?
Yes, that's what I said.
So,
but the brisa is not. The brisa is a Tana.
Okay, we don't know who authored that.
We don't know who authored the brisa, but it doesn't make a difference, especially when when we don't have any author. Presumably that's supposed to be the unanimous view. So how do we understand that unanimous view with and make that consistent with Rav Kahana's statement? And that's the question that Abaye and Rava are addressing.
Okay, but they're also Amoraim, and they're discussing.
Yeah, they're answering the question that's on Rav Kahana. Exactly.
Right. Okay. Right.
All right. Have a wonderful day. Have a great Shabbos. Thank you, everybody.
What were you saying?